Welcome back to the fourth installment of our series
entitled The Hidden Structure, Looking Beyond the Surface. If you recall what we did last video, we were talking about the thesis and understood it by way of the thesis evaluation graph. And we were able to place it along these two dimensions, the argument and the scope dimension. And what we're going to do today is we're going to delve even deeper into this thing we call the thesis, right? And just as a little taste of what it is we're going to be doing, we are essentially going to take your thesis and then we're going to break it apart into its component parts. And what that is going to do is actually going to allow us to see precisely what are the parts that make up your thesis. In other words, we're going to have what we will call the objects. And then secondarily, what we're going to do is we're going to then describe the relationships between those objects. So in this case, the TH comes before the ES. That's the relationship. And the second one being the ES comes before the IS. Right? And what that now allows us to do, once we've specified the objects and the relationships, it allows us to bring the thesis back together, but understand precisely the parts that make it up. Right? So this is what we're going to be doing. Saying that essentially, any argument we can break into these two components, objects and relationships, just like this. That is the big point, or big takeaway point for today's video. But let's start it with this right here. You have a sprinter, posture, getting ready to run. Of course, you can see muscles are firing, top shape, ready to go. But what we see on the surface, the muscles, the organs, everything, right? If we would have X-ray, what is it that we would see? Well, this right here, right? The skeleton. And if you think about the skeleton, right? The skeleton is actually crucial. Without the skeleton, what would happen? Well, the muscles, the organs, any of these kinds of things, they wouldn't be able to hold up. So in this case, our sprinter would just, sort of just fall onto the ground, just flap right onto the ground. Cannot hold itself up. And so if we look at the skeleton, we realize that in fact, it's at the heart of everything. It's holding everything else up. Without the skeleton, nothing else would be able to stand. And this is essentially what we're going to be doing today. We're going to say that on the surface is what we see on the left, but what holds the thesis up, what holds the content of the thesis up, is this thing beneath it or underneath it, which is the structure or the logic structure. What's illustrated like this, right? We have the content of the thesis. This is literally what we read. And in the back, hidden, is a logical structure that upholds the thesis. And what we're going to be doing is focus on this logical structure. We're going to try to tease out and highlight what that structure looks like. And you'll see that there are all kinds of benefits that we can get from going through this exercise. And the reason why we want to do this, as to identify the thesis structure, is really for two reasons, okay? The first, it allows us to highlight the underlying logic of the thesis. Now, this is not something to be underestimated. It's actually crucial. Oftentimes, as a reader, we get stuck on content, big jargon, and are unable to actually understand what the argument is. And the same thing goes for the authors, where we ourselves get caught in the content and do not properly specify what the underlying logic is of an argument. Right? And so what this exercise allows us to do is actually reveal this structure, this underlying logic, make it really explicit so that we can see it, investigate it, and understand it. And if need be, correct it. Second, because we now have highlighted the structure, what we are now able to do is see the component parts very, very clearly. And it is those component parts that you must be able to prove as the author. That is your job. All of the component parts is what you need to prove. And this is why, for these two reasons, why we want to go through this exercise. Right? And so with that, let's try our hands on what will be perhaps sort of the simplest version of this structure that I have in mind. So here we have it. Drinking coffee makes Vanessa happy. It's pretty straightforward. So go ahead and let's map it on to the back. So what do we have here? Well, first we have drinking coffee. So we'll just now illustrate this symbolically onto the back, just like this. The second is Vanessa is happy. That's the second, so we'll indicate it as this. And then lastly, makes, right? And we'll indicate that as a simple arrow. And so what we see then is that drinking coffee is represented by the coffee cup, makes is represented by the arrow, and Vanessa is happy represented by the smiley face. And in fact, we can even further abstract it. We don't even need to use a smiley face or a coffee cup. We can just simply call it this, A and B. Point being is that these are just two objects. And so if you look at the logical structure of this thesis, really what it is saying is what? A makes B. A being drinking coffee and B being Vanessa happy. And so what we can see then is in this structure, we actually have captured the logic. And in fact, not just this thesis statement, we actually can describe various kinds of thesis statement with that same simple structure. So for instance, take this. Brushing teeth prevents cavities. A prevents B. Or sleeping aids concentration. A aids B. And lastly, smoking increases the risk for lung cancer. A increases B. So here we have it. And this is the crucial part. We're saying that any thesis, in fact, any argument, we can break down into two components. Any argument can be broken down into, first of all, a set of objects. Here in our case, it is smoking and risk for lung cancer. And then second, any argument along with these objects can be broken down into what? A set of relations that connect the objects. Here represented as the arrow going from A to B. Now, as for the relations between objects, we can actually have many kinds of relations. The relationship between A and B can be positive. So A causes, brings about, increases, or augments B. It can be negative. A prevents, eliminates, decreases, or deflates B. It can be neutral. A shapes, purifies, carries, squishes B. And lastly, it can indicate membership. A belongs to, occurs within, is a member, or is attached to B. So we can see that there are many types of relationships that can bind our objects together. But either way, the point being is that any argument, we can break into this, a set of objects and the relations between the objects. And one thing to note is that this kind of structure can be arbitrarily long. What I just showed you earlier was the simplest version. Two objects, one relation. But we can have many more objects and many more relations. And in fact, we're going to be seeing this later on. Indeed, what we're going to be doing now actually is give it a try. Right? Let's go ahead and try to identify a thesis structure for an example that's slightly more complicated. So here it is. Now I encourage you to stop the video right now, read through this, and try for yourself to understand what the logic is here. So go ahead and stop the video, and I'll wait. Okay, so I'm assuming that you have stopped the video, you have given it a try, and if you're like most people, you've probably looked at this. The catalytic diosolution correls a forgitolisovin agent and thereby neutralizes the agitogent hazard dioxin. Most people will probably say, I have no idea what this thing just said. Right? No clue. This is gibberish to me. But not so fast. There actually is a lot of meaning that we can get here. And in fact, the point I want to make here is that we don't want to focus on the content. The very thing that is confusing to you is the very thing that I'm asking you to just simply ignore. And what we're going to do is just simply, as we said, right? Any argument consists of what? A set of objects and the relationships. So let's start with words that signal relationships in this thesis statement. Here they are. You have two relationship terms, correls and neutralizes. So what we'll do now is we're going to use these relationship terms and then gradually build the underlying logic of this thesis statement. So with that, let's start with the first one, corrals. Right? Let's think about this. What is it that we're saying? Well, something corrals something. All right? So what is it that is doing the corralling? Well, right here, this big term, catalytic dissolution. And here's the beauty. We don't want to get stuck on these terms. All that matters to us is that this entire term is something that is doing the corralling. So what we're going to do is we're simply just going to designate it as A. Right? And we're going to say that A corrals something. Right? So now the next question becomes, well, what is A corralling? Well, the thing right here, the volatile agent. Again, this is a mouthful. We don't want to get stuck on this term. So what we're going to do is just simply say, well, it's just B. That's what we're going to designate it. So here we have it then. We have our first relationship. Right? A corrals B. Now we're going to do the second thing, the neutralizes term. Again, another relationship term. Just as we did before, we're going to ask, well, something neutralizes something. So what is doing the neutralizing? Right here. And guess what? We already have this term. We called it B. So B is neutralizing something. And what is it neutralizing? This thing right here. Agitogen hazard dioxin. And just as we did before, we do not concern ourselves with this jargon. And instead, just simply call it C. Because we do not care about the content in order to understand the argument. And here we have it. We have the second relationship. B neutralizes C. So if we then go through this, right, what we find is this. A corrals B, and B in turn neutralizes C. There you go. What we've just done is we went from something that we didn't understand at all to now having discovered what the underlying structure is. What is the actual logic of the argument? As you can see here, we don't need to know the content in order to know the argument. Right? What the thesis statement is saying simply that A corrals B and B in turn neutralizes C. That is what this thesis statement is arguing. Right? And that is what we want to focus on. So now that we have this, we already have taken a big step forward. We now actually understand the underlying argument. So with that, what we've just accomplished is the first task, right? Revealing the logic beneath the surface. Great. So now let's move to the second part. Illuminating the component parts that must be proven. Let's see. Okay, so here it is again. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with B. Okay? And even though it's just an object, there actually is a lot of information embedded in just the relationships here. That we know a lot about B just by way of the relationships. The first thing we know about B is that B is being corralled. Right? And so what that means is what? For something to be able to be corralled, it must be dispersed so they can be brought together. That's what it means to be corralled, or to corral, right? To bring something together. So the way we can think about B then is the following. We can just simply say, well, B is a set of circles, molecules, whatever you want to imagine these things to be. The point is that these balls are far apart from each other. They are dispersed, right? And what we are then told is that A corrals B. In other words, what A does to B is this. It literally brings it together. It corrals B. So now conceptually, we already have an understanding of what B is and what A is doing to B. Okay? Now let's move to the second part, saying that B neutralizes C. But what does that mean? What it is saying that B, when it's in its corral state, is able to mute, to render C obsolete or prevent C from doing what it wants to do. Now the crucial thing is this. According to this thesis, B, when it's in its dispersed state, does not neutralize C. That means if B is in its dispersed state, then C can just do whatever it's doing. It's just dancing around, doing its thing, hey, feeling good. But B neutralizes C when it is corralled. And so here then we have it, right? We have this relationship, A corrals B, and B neutralizes C. And we have now a much deeper understanding of what this means. So now we can actually ask questions about what the author needs to be able to prove. So for the first part, we, for instance, can say this. The author has got to make sure that the audience understand what A and B is. The audience needs to understand what it is about B that allows it to be corralled or be in a dispersed state. The audience needs to understand what A is. What are the component parts? What makes up A? Second, what is the logic by which A corrals B? Right? This process that you are positing, that you are advancing, you're saying is actually happening. Well, how? Right? What is it about A that enables it to corral B? Is B unable to corral itself? Why? Is it perhaps another factor that we don't know about that corrals B and it's not really A? So in this case, that logic you have to be able to spell out. And then lastly, you want to ask, well, how do we know? How do you actually know that what you are saying happened actually happens? What kind of evidence do you provide? Now, the same thing we can do for B neutralizing C. We'll ask the same thing here. What is C? We want to again understand here, what is this object? If you think about what we're saying, right, that at one time it's able to do something, and other times it's not, right? So we want to understand what that is. What is C? Secondly, we want to ask, well, what is the logic by which B neutralizes C? Right? This idea of being neutralized. Why is it that C can no longer operate the way it did before when B is in this particular kind of state, in this corralled state? That logic you must be able to explain and convince the reader of. And here again, we can ask this question, how do we know? That is not obvious at all. Right? What kinds of evidence are you using? Are you using some kind of statistical analysis? Right? Collecting data? Is it perhaps interviews that you've done? What kinds of evidence are you using to convince your reader that what you are arguing is actually the case? And so then here we have it. Here we have a set of questions that the author must be able to address and convince the reader of in order to actually illustrate that their thesis is valid. And so then to recap what we've just done, this is quite a bit that we've done, right? We started with a thesis that was quite difficult to understand, right? Initially it was sort of intimidating. And what we did is to say, well, let's just stop. Let's not get caught up in the content, but instead let's look at the underlying structure, right? This parallel process that is going on here. On the surface, you see the content, but oftentimes just focusing on the content is problematic. You get stuck. What you want to do instead is focus on what is beneath, what is hidden. And that's what we did here, right? So we were able to identify the underlying structure. And we saw that we can describe the underlying logic, understand the argument, by simply specifying the set of objects and the relationships that connect those objects. And then lastly, from there, what we did is took the next step, and that is identify the component parts and what precisely it is that our author has to convince the reader of. What are the kinds of questions that the author must be able to answer in order to validate their thesis? So here we have it. These are the 3 steps that we took. And this is the crucial part, right? We can break down any argument into a set of objects and relations. And that in turn opens up to do all kinds of other things. Now, I'll leave you with this thesis statement here. Okay? In fact, what we're going to be doing is address or break down this thesis statement in the next video. But for now, I encourage you to go ahead and give it a try and see if you can succeed at breaking it down just like the way we did in the previous thesis. So with that, I guess I should leave you with one more thing. And that is these 3 terms right here. Some of you may have looked at them and be like, I'm not even sure if they're real. Well, you're right. These are completely made up. Okay, I'm guilty. I made them up. But the point that I was conveying is that there's nothing special about what I just wrote. You can take any kind of technical journal that you're not familiar with, whether it's biology or physics or gender studies, any field that you're unfamiliar with, you will come across jargon that you don't understand. But the critical thing that I'm saying here is that the point is to look past the content. That in order to understand the argument, we actually do not need to know what the content is. What we need to know is what the relationship between the objects are. That's where the argument lies. Not in the content, but in the structure. So with that, thank you for watching. I'll see you next video.